Hey everybody, this is Gabriel Posner coming to you from Denver, Colorado. And at the recent convention for the Association of Hanna Somatic Education, I did a workshop on recalibrating our primary technique that we use with clients called pendiculation. So this presentation is the slides from the workshop that I did, which will hopefully give you a sense of what we covered and allow you to kind of explore this topic a little bit more on your own. And pendiculation, generally the theme of that technique or how we do it is to get the effects of what people are looking for when they typically stretch, but without actually stretching tissue or muscle. In this presentation, I'm going to go over the historical origins of that word pendiculation, where we see it coming up in some modern research, and how we use it as clinical or Hanna somatic educators. All of this comes from a mindset of recalibration. How do we get better at doing what we're doing? So I'll go over some keys to success that have worked for me and that have worked for a lot of other somatic educators. And I want you to stay open to this for the opportunities for improvement, both for yourself as well as for me. Let me know how this information sits with you, what resonates, what doesn't, what feedback you have, so that we can all get better together. In general, the topic that I brought to the AHSC and the reason I brought it there was that this is challenging work. We learn it during our main trainings. We recalibrate the protocols every time we get together at the conventions, but we don't always take the time to really recalibrate exactly how we're pendiculating. So it was a great time at the convention, and I hope you enjoy the information here. To start off, the word pendiculate turns out it has its roots in the Latin language, coming from either the basic word of pendere, which is to stretch or spread, or pendiculare, which is to stretch oneself. Now, I've always thought about it a little bit differently, separating the word into two words, pan and articulate. Pan referring to whole or all, such as a pandemic, which is like encompassing a disease, all-encompassing disease, or Pangea, that mega continent when all of our individual continents were together as one. And then articulate to mean moving joints separately. Put that together and you get this concept that I think really resonates with the somatic use of pendiculation, which is moving all the individual joints together as one. The way that's classically described is as the stretching component of a yawn and stretch maneuver. Usually it is involuntary, usually connected with yawning, although not always. Sometimes people yawn separately, and sometimes they yawn and stretch. But it is sometimes even thought of as combined in what is referred to as the stretch yawn syndrome. Why it is a syndrome, I don't know, but that is the way I've seen it described. This is not only involuntary, but it is also hereditary, meaning we don't learn how to do that. We come out of the womb already able to pendiculate, already able to yawn and stretch. In fact, when they do images of fetuses and future humans in utero, they see that at 12 weeks of gestation, you can already see pendicular activity happening. This is also seen in every single other animal species. If you've ever been to the zoo or looked at your pets or watched any animal ever, you will probably see them at some point going into a classic movement series, such as downward dog, such as cat, cow, right? Some kind of movement as they go from a period of rest to a period of activity. And for that reason, it is thought to be very strongly related to the maintenance of homeostatic balance, the body's desire to self-correct and to restore itself, to prepare itself for action and to rest and recover when action isn't required. Pendiculation seems to be about changing activity levels and changing arousal levels, going from a period of rest to a period of activity, or going from a state of tired and sleepiness to a state of alertness and focus. It's thought to be initiated by the hypothalamus, which is this area in the brain, right in the center. And I put the arrows on there so you could see the way that it is directly above the brainstem. So the brainstem sits above the spinal cord, where all of your motor nerves and sensory nerves come in and out into the rest of the body. And above that, you have this hypothalamus, which has helped to regulate our various states through movement. When we feel hungry, when we feel thirsty, when we feel sleepy, these are some of the homeostatic signals that trigger actions. Okay? It is also seems to be connected to circadian rhythms. So when our energy levels start to dip, we may yawn in order to bring ourselves back into alertness. It is thought to restore myofascial integrity as well. The idea that in preparation for action, an organism will stretch and pendiculate to recalibrate muscle tone and to recalibrate myofascial integrity, meaning that when there's stress on a part of the body or part of the organism, the fascia can tend to thicken and almost harden, and that pendiculation helps to restore that to a more elastic, a more movement allowing, a more communication allowing, fluid state that is more conducive of optimal functioning. And one of the other studies I saw looked at the way that pendiculation might be part of what switches the brain from a state of relaxed rest, and that's called the default state, to a more focused, alert, or attentive state. The classic description that I found was from this researcher, Fraser, who documented a lot of animal pendiculation and described generally pendiculation as a series of coordinated actions that build sequentially with contraction. So they're not building into stretch, they're actually building into contraction. At the peak of the movement, joints are maximally extended, so all the way open, and then inversely all the way flexed. After each sequential movement, after each buildup of contraction, there is typically a fast release of that tension. And they find that when involuntary, when induced naturally, the experience tends to be pleasurable. All of these things I've experienced myself and would concur 100% with. Rosenberg also offered that this is one of an example of what he calls a modal action pattern. These are fixed motor patterns, different than reflexes, which tend to be very fast. These are slower movements that are carried out methodically, sequentially, and repeatably. So we do the same series of patterns every time that we enact a modal action pattern. For example, in one of the lectures Thomas Hanna recorded, he talks about how spiders, when they build webs, will build that web the exact same way every single time that they build it. So if you have a spider that in the corner of your room on one side starts to build a web and you decide to pick that little spider up and move them on the other side, that spider is going to continue building that web from the point where they were stopped. They're not going to start over until that web is completed. So in the same way, once an involuntary pendiculation is initiated, it tends to be completed, tends to be carried out all the way to completion. In that way, they are full body, they are reflecting reflexive movements. So you might say incorporated into our particular pattern of pendiculation, of yawning and stretching, is a variety of reflex patterns that are also survival based. Backing up a second, anything that is homeostatic, anything that is involuntary, anything that is hereditary, any actions that we come into this world knowing how to do are thought to have some sort of survival mechanism. Why would you inherit a motor pattern if it was just unnecessary, right? So if we were going to inherit it, it must have some important function for us. Okay, this is thought to be homeostatic, but also within it contains other movements that are also very necessary for survival, such as the withdrawal response of pain, such as the fear startle response we call red light, or the Landau excitatory response. So when we as Hanna somatic educators are bringing a client into and out of those larger reflex patterns through a pendiculation, we're very directly aligned with the classical construction of this concept. Okay. We also see with animals and in humans that sometimes pendiculation isn't full body, but is about recalibrating one specific area of themselves. And that typically happens when it is self-corrective, when there's some kind of injury or recalibration that needs to happen in that area. So long story short, it is homeostatic, helps to balance our energy levels. If you're falling asleep right now, go ahead and take a nice, slow, big yawn and see if that perks you up a little bit. Helps to reset muscle tone and helps to restore myofascial integrity. And you can look online. There's lots of great videos on YouTube of various animals pendiculating. I would highly recommend you check out the video of pelicans yawning, stretching. It's quite fascinating. So how do we as Hanna or clinical somatic educators use this technique? Well, for us, pendiculation is not involuntary. It's something that is voluntarily initiated and completed. So the whole process is voluntary and is controlled. Both the buildup and cessation of the contraction is gradual in the way that we do it, as opposed to the classic involuntary way where you build up, you let go fast. Here we want to control that release of contraction gradually. That's where we're getting a lot of the benefit of resetting the muscle tone. Also for us, load is important. Weight is important because weight helps to enhance the sensory experience of the movement. So pendiculations, when done voluntarily, are always done under load. Either that load is simply gravity, which is going to be different when you are just in air versus if you are in water, versus if you were pendiculating on the moon or in a spaceship or on Mars someday. So the amount of gravity is going to affect the experience of the pendiculation. Similarly, when we're working in one-on-one sessions with people, we're going to use touch to enhance and change the amount of load that is occurring during the pendiculation. The movements are typically full body. All of the cat stretch movements that we teach are really full body movements. So each one is designed to bring up motor patterns and to integrate the whole system around those motor patterns, and are reflective of reflexive patterns, right? The green light, red light, or trauma reflexes that I mentioned earlier. Also, pendiculations, the way we teach it, can be done around specific joints. So we can work with the limbs and doing specific pendiculations to unwind any occupational patterns, any repetitive strain patterns, or any injury patterns that are developed around that specific limb. Personally, I like to use the terms guided voluntary pendiculation or enhanced voluntary pendiculation. I think acronyms are helpful sometimes. So GVP or EVP, either way, it is always voluntary, but it's either guided by me to a client of mine, or guided by me to myself, talking myself through a pendiculation or listening to a tape or video of somebody else. When it is enhanced, that means that we are applying extra load to it in some way, using our hands primarily. Why do we think it works? So what do we believe as somatic educators is underlying the benefits that we get from voluntary pendiculations? Well, one is that novel and slow movement activates the motor and sensory cortices in the brain. When we're moving differently than we normally do, and when we're slowing it down to the point that it becomes a little bit choppy or skippy, that means that we're starting to get the very top of the brain, the voluntary motor and sensory cortices involved. Once those sensory and motor cortices are engaged and are activated, we're going to use them to slowly inhibit the motor units. So gradually releasing more and more motor units, allowing the muscles involved in that pendiculation to get longer and longer and longer. As part of that process, we are inhibiting the firing of spindle cells. Spindle cells are what trigger the sensation of a stretch, because when a spindle cell is fired, it causes the muscle to tighten back up to resist further lengthening. So one of the reasons that Hanna Somatics is so effective at helping people reduce tension is because it inhibits the spindle cell from firing, allows the muscle to lengthen and relax more than it normally does. In that process, allowing the resting tone, the former resting tone, to be surpassed and putting in a new resting tone. With repetition, this gradually helps to restore the full resting length to a muscle and helps to recalibrate, again, the functional integrity of the soma, meaning helps to get all the bones connecting the way that they would need to connect, helping the joints to work the way that they were designed to work, and helping the system to work in a more integrated fashion, sharing the load throughout the soma rather than force being exerted in an imbalanced way. Oftentimes we hear the technique that we do compared to proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And I know for myself, when I was coming out of massage school and first starting to learn Hanna Somatics, I was wondering, well, how is this really different than PNF? I had learned PNF as part of my massage training, and there are some similarities. So I did a little bit of study into the way that it's talked about compared to an enhanced voluntary pendiculation. I just wanted to put this slide out there. One difference is that with EVP, we are staying within the stretch limit. We're not trying to bring a muscle to its end length. And so we're not bringing it into a stretch. On the other hand, a PNF is going to start by finding the end length of that muscular joint and bringing that part of the body into a stretch. Secondly, for EVP, load is built up while moving into a concentric contraction. So coming into the contraction, shortening all the muscles slowly and gradually while increasing the load. Versus with a PNF, I would put my hand here to resist the movement from the very beginning, and then load would build up into that static hand and maintained. With EVP, the load is relative to the resting tone, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But load is not the same for each area of the soma. It's not the same for each person, and it's not the same when that person comes back for one session to the next. So load is always going to be variable, which makes it more challenging. With a PNF, load is described as maximal. Now this is different than I learned it in a massage school. We learned it to be about 10 to 20% of their strength. But the way I saw it described, at least in one of the articles, was that load is tended to be maximal, as hard as they can. They want to press into it. And then the contraction with a PNF is held for a specific amount of time, 60 seconds, a minute, whatever, or 2 minutes, however amount of time it's supposed to be. Versus with EVP, we don't hold the load at the top of the contraction. The release begins shortly after the concentric phase ends. At the convention, somebody described this as a ball when you throw it up in the air. As it starts to come down, there's a moment where it pauses. So we want to trace that movement up, let it pause at the top, and then it starts to come down. And the release is also gradual, controlled, steady, versus in PNF, after that holding period of time, the release is uncontrolled and fast. We want to make sure that the release is done with as much control, if not more, as the concentric shortening phase, because that's when we're really inhibiting the stretch reflex, inhibiting the muscle fibers more and more and more, and allowing that joint to return to a resting position. We are going to release to relaxation. This can be done by having a bolster or pillow. It can be done sometimes using your own body part, so that as the joint is opening up, here I'm letting my elbow joint here open up. I'm letting my bicep relax because my arm is now resting on this arm here. as opposed to letting the arm completely lengthen up, which would then trigger a stretch reflex in my bicep. The very muscle that we were just lengthening, all of a sudden we're going to let it tighten up. Doesn't quite make sense. So we're going to release to relaxation. In PNF, the release is done to a new stretch. So they're releasing, and then all of a sudden they're stretching again. Another thing is that after we release, we're going to go ahead and invite movement in the opposite direction, what we call a lock-in, by recruiting the opposite muscle group, which sends a signal through the spinal cord to reflexively let go of that muscle even more, helps to lock in the new length of that muscle. In PNF, after a release, they often hold the new stretch again for a certain amount of time. One of the other differences, and probably the most dramatic in terms of how this information is picked up and used, is that PNF, they actually have a fair amount of research talking about what they do, documenting it, and describing some of the benefits of it. And there tends to be some benefits to PNF in terms of joint range of motion. With EVP, with pendiculation, the way that we do it as somatic educators, there's currently no clinical studies. So that's certainly something that needs to change if we're going to really document what we're doing, if we're going to actually discover how much benefit a person is getting from doing this work, and if we're going to improve the technique and figure out how to really do it optimally. So far, we're doing it based on our anecdotal experience, our own personal experiences, and on conversations with each other. But we really need to document those effects. Just to throw this in there, I don't want to do a whole big thing on traditional stretching, but there is a lot of research out there on static versus ballistic versus dynamic stretching. None of it is all that mind-blowing to me. It shows that there doesn't tend to be much effect on performance. In fact, if it's done before exercise, static stretching tends to have a negative effect. It can lead to instability, it can lead to decreased performance. If done independent of sports, afterwards or on an off day, there has been shown to be some effect from it in terms of muscle length, joint length. So some evidence out there that certain kinds of stretching work. Ballistic stretching can lead to increased injuries. This is when you are essentially throwing yourself with velocity into a stretch, bouncing back out of it. I would highly not recommend that. I don't really recommend static stretching either, because you're going to be spending a lot of time to not really get that much benefit. The muscle is going to return to that length pretty quickly. So pendiculation, the way that we do it, is going to theoretically be much more effective at actually turning off the muscle contraction rather than just pulling on it until it lengthens. So as I said, with enhanced voluntary pendiculation, we're going to use touch to provide the enhancement. Touch helps to primarily provide more sensory feedback. If all of a sudden I put my hand right here, my brain is going to go to there because there's something new to notice. The brain goes wherever we touch. We have to be careful about that. We don't want to have our hands unnecessarily all over the body, all over the soma. We want to touch deliberately and clearly, and for a reason. So touch is useful in order to help highlight the bones or joints that are moving. Now there's something more to feel with my hand here. Touch can also help to highlight the muscle that is contracting. If someone is really not sensing the tightening and loosening of their muscle, applying some touch can help them to feel that contraction, feel that softening as they relax to rest. Touch also can provide additional load. So again, we always have gravity as our primary source of load. Touch adds extra weight to increase effort. Extra effort requires extra muscle recruitment. When there's extra muscle recruitment, now there's more to feel. So touch essentially, again, provides more sensory input. It also can be helpful for slowing down the movement. If someone is flowing, oh yeah, I can pendiculate, look at this. Now you load up in a little bit, and now they have to work a little bit harder, and they have to go slow, and you can have to direct the quality of the movement much more. So a couple ways that we use touch. It can be static. Our load can be static when the intention is to increase effort. If someone's kind of just not using enough effort to really have a impact on their muscle tone, then letting your hand be static for a moment as they continue moving allows you to build that load with them so that you're not pressing down, you're letting your hand stay there and they are building the load into your hand. That helps you increase effort. When you've got the desired amount of load, then you continue moving with them. It can also be done in a moving fashion when the intention is simply to highlight the movement. Again, if I want to help somebody experience the elevation and depression of their scapula, I might put my finger right here and say lift that up, and then sense it as it lowers down. When we are using touch, it's really important to consider the vector that we're coming from, the line of force. The direction that we have our soma, the angle that we are coming from, is going to change the experience for that person. So in a classic example, if we're doing an internal and external rotation of the hip, and we're either facing straight on versus at an angle towards their hip versus at an angle toward their shoulder, that's going to change which muscles they are recruiting for that movement. It's going to change which joints they're recruiting for that movement. There's not necessarily right or wrong about that, but the simple point that we want to get aligned in our own somas and clear about the experience that we want them to have during the pendiculation, and use our line of force, use our touch to encourage the most beneficial experience in that moment. So some other things to consider when you're thinking about how much load, how much touch to use. One of the ways I think about this is the ratio of signal to noise. Now this comes up a lot in like sound theory, signal to noise, right? The idea that in order to hear the tone you're looking for in a song, let's say, you have to reduce the surrounding noise. If you're looking for one specific line or one specific tone, it's helpful if that ratio is in the direction of more signal, less noise. For someone with a lot of muscle tension, this means that they may not be able to perceive what they're doing because there's so much noise or so much unnecessary contraction going on in their soma. Now there's two ways to handle that ratio. One of them is to increase the signal and the other one is to decrease the noise. So the first way, we could use load to encourage greater muscle recruitment, greater effort, thereby increasing the sensory signal of that movement. They're not able to feel it, make them work a little bit harder, at least initially, and now there's something they can actually feel by increasing the signal. On the other hand, decreasing the noise. So with repetition of the pendiculation, as you help their whole soma become more and more relaxed, you're generally decreasing the muscle activity, thereby decreasing the background noise and allowing them to become much more sensitive to subtler and subtler movemts. This was also described very clearly in Feldenkrais's explanation of the Weber-Fechner law, which asserts that the relationship between a perceived stimulus and the least noticeable change in that stimulus is a pretty set ratio. That if I'm coming in with a lot of muscle tension, I'm going to need a substantial amount more to notice some kind of change in the amount of tension that I have. However, if I'm coming in and I'm fairly relaxed, it's not going to take me much extra muscle tension to notice a change. Imagine that you were at the gym and you're lifting a 100-pound barbell press, right? It would probably take 5 or 10 pounds of extra weight before you said, hey, that's actually more weight. If you were to simply only lift 1 more pound, you might not even notice that there's a change. On the other hand, if you're lifting up a stack of playing cards and somebody puts a 1-pound weight on top of that, you're going to notice that extra pound because it is large in relation to the initial weight. So there's a steady ratio between that. Doesn't matter what exactly the number is, because we're not measuring precisely how much load that we're using, at least right now. But the general idea is that if someone is starting from a point of high contraction, you're probably going to need to start with a stronger load, at least initially, before they're going to notice any change. As they start to get more and more relaxed and closer to actual resting tone, you'll be able to use a lighter load because they're going to be more sensitive to that movement, they're going to be more sensitive to the changes. And that's going to allow them to have greater and greater refinement of their movements. Something else really important to consider is gravity is your friend. Let's work with gravity. It's always there. Again, that is our primary source of load. And no matter where our line of force is coming from, there's always this extra force pulling from the earth. So the more that we can work with gravity, the easier our job is going to be. That's my personal advice. I know sometimes you can't get around that. There are specific kinds of pendiculations that really benefit from working against gravity, but my suggestion is before exploring and going right to those anti-gravity pendiculations, see if you can adjust your client's posture, see if you can adjust their position, or use bolsters in some way to let gravity be on your side. Meaning that it's a lot easier to kind of lean back with gravity than to lift up. Hope that makes sense. And absolutely crucial, we need to always remember that our clients are always in charge. So we're moving only when the client moves. I was describing, the need to create more load if someone's not using much effort, they're moving too fast. That doesn't mean that we're going to start pressing down on their arm. We're going to keep that hand steady and let them bring the load up into our own hands. So a load is initiated and built during the shortening phase and is done by the client. If the client stops moving, we stop moving because the client is always in charge. I like to think of it that our hand in an EVP is connected to our soma. Our soma, therefore, is simply an extension of our client's soma. So allow our whole body to move with them during the pendiculation. Again, the load is built during the shortening phase and then is maintained through the lengthening. So whatever load you come to at the peak of the movement, try to maintain that all the way through the lengthening phase of the pendiculation. If you lose the connection, have them press back into it, reload. If you need to change your own position because you recognize that they're not recruiting the muscles you're intending them to recruit, or you don't see the movement happening the way you're intending it to, reload, start it over again. In my own experience, load variability creates a lack of clarity. It's hard to feel exactly what's going on there. And ultimately, it's going to be unsatisfying, just as if you weren't going to complete a yawn all the way through, it's going to be a little bit unsatisfying. So to make sure that it's a pleasurable and that it's an integral experience for your clients, keep that load clear and steady. It can help to use props or hands, the idea that you need to relax to a rest, not to a stretch. So you want to have lots of different props or body parts ready so that you can assist them in coming to full rest rather than a stretch. All right, so lots of stuff to think about there. Just want to throw this up there. These are some of the references that I used when I was putting these slides together and some of the studies that I found most helpful in really understanding the way that pendiculation has been classically talked about, the ways that yawning is being studied and stretching. And as I said at the beginning, I very much welcome your feedback and comments. So leave them at the bottom of this video. Email me at gabriel@elevatedsomatics.com and enjoy pendiculating.